We're thrilled to have our guests here today, and Vice Admiral McGinn is a member of the Military Advisory Board at the Center for Naval Analyses, which has put out several reports recently over the last few years on the nexus of climate change and security issues. He also retired from the U.S. Navy after 35 years, serving in a variety of posts. Test aviator, the aircraft carrier commanding officer, national security strategist, and I believe the last hat you wore there was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for wartime requirements and programs at the Pentagon. So just a wealth of experience there from our U.S. government. And we're also privileged to have here with us today Rear Admiral Neil Morisetti from the UK Royal Navy, who has been serving for 34 years there and currently serves as the Climate and Energy Security Envoy, representing the UK Ministry of Defence and the Foreign Commonwealth Office. So thank you both for joining us here today, and we certainly look forward to your remarks. We'll proceed first with planned remarks from each of our admirals here, and then have a panel discussion and take questions from the audience. Okay, Admiral McGinn, you want to?
Thank you, Ashley, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. And that's exactly what we'd like to have as a discussion. Admiral Morisetti and I have worked together before in various nations and a couple of spots around the United States. And we found that what we'd like to do with our remarks is simply put a framework around a set of topics: energy, climate change, and international security, and then to hear what is on your minds. We're here in Texas for several reasons, not the least of which is that Texas is blessed with many, many energy resources of many different varieties. Texas is a large state with many different types of environments, from coastal islands, low-lying islands, and a harbor infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, to the high plains and way out west desert. And it's really important for us to get a feel for how the people of Texas are viewing things like climate change and energy security in that national security context. As Ashley said, I'm a member of the CNA Military Advisory Board. This is a group of retired admirals and generals that came together in 2006, did about 15 months or so of research and analysis, a lot of that centered on talking to some of the world's experts about climate change, and put out a report in April of 2007 titled Climate Change and the Threat to National Security. It was groundbreaking at the time because a lot of folks said, gosh, what a bunch of retired admirals and generals talking about climate change. Isn't that the stuff that the environmentalists and the big business people are always fighting over? Well, the point was, we took a good look at it, and we decided that climate change was, in fact, very relevant to the future strategic environment and would very definitely have a significant place to play, or should have, in strategic planning for national and international security. The principal conclusion from that report was that climate change and the severe weather effects that it would produce, everything from multi-year droughts that would cause crop failure, to high temperatures in urban environments, coastal environments that were affected by rising sea level, not the Hollywood version, but even just something a meter or less in sea level rise, inundation by local floods. I think you can probably identify with that here in Austin and across a large swath of Texas after the tropical storm came through just last week. And all of these effects would act as a threat multiplier for instability in critical areas of the world, most of them, but not all, located between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. But the problem with climate change in the political rhetoric that we have today is that it's a very complex topic. It's one that is not clearly understood. There's some uncertainty to it, and a lot of people have seized on that uncertainty and overlooked some of the complexity of it to say, this can't be happening. It's a normal cycle. This is something that even if it is happening, we can't do anything about it. And certainly we don't want to alter our lifestyle or affect our economies by going after some myth that's put out there by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The arguments for and against the effects of climate change rage on. Well, early on in our efforts at the Military Advisory Board, we simply said this. It was best articulated by our chairman, General Gordon Sullivan, who was the former Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And he said, look, we're not climate scientists. We never have 100% certainty about anything. But if you wait for 100% certainty on the battlefield, something bad is going to happen. So let's recognize that there will be uncertainty. And as military planners, as strategists, we basically said, what do? You look at trends, you look at indicators, and you look at warnings. And in the case of climate change, it seemed very, very evident to us that the warning signs were quite clear. And that we as a nation and we as an international community needed to take prudent actions based on those warning signs and those trend lines. We couldn't tell, nor can climate scientists, precisely when, precisely where, precisely in what form these severe weather events would take place, but suffice it to say that with a future filled with increased frequency and increased intensity and geographical diversity and phenomena diversity in weather events, it was going to be a different world, a different security environment. So what does this threat multiplier for instability really mean? It simply means this. Well, I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that climate change and the severe weather effects that are attendant to it are going to cause wars. But if you look around the world, there are areas of tension, fault lines, if you will, along religious, political, economic lines. And there's conflict, there's tension across these fault lines, and in many cases, they've been there for literally hundreds of years. The problem with climate change is that it adds another dimension, another degree of difficulty to fragile societies and fragile governments. That additional pressure, that acceleration along these fault lines can cause them to fail. And into that vacuum of power in a failed society, unsupported by a competent government, will rush all forms of extreme thought. Paramilitaries, organized crime, extremists of every ilk, offering solutions that could, to an impoverished, very, very stressed society, large migratory population, cause them to have a lot of unrest. It could cause cross-border incursions and could, at the very least, create tremendous scenarios related to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, much as we've seen around the world today and over the past, certainly over the past 20 years. At worst, it could escalate. I'll use Pakistan and what's going on there today. As you probably know, there's been massive monsoonal type of rain that's been falling in Pakistan and flooding the whole Indus River from India in the north through Pakistan all the way down to the Indian Ocean. This has affected over 20 million people in a country, in a society that has, at best, what I would describe as a fragile governmental infrastructure able to respond to this. That's why, as we speak here in Austin, Texas, there are fine Marines and sailors and soldiers and airmen from the United States, from the United Kingdom, and from other countries that are there trying to provide the basics of life to the Pakistani people. Now, Pakistan also has a couple of other aspects besides a huge life-altering flood going on and the impact on the human beings there that are affected. And that is, they have an ongoing insurgency that is deadly, caused by the Pakistan Taliban, and they have nuclear weapons. And they live in a bad neighborhood. There's a neighborhood of tension along some of those fault lines that I mentioned before. So the last thing you'd like to see in a country like Pakistan or Bangladesh or China or India or Brazil or Mexico is added stress on societies and governments that are getting by, but not with a whole bunch of resiliency. So what should we do about this? Well, the other conclusion of our report in 2007 was that climate change, energy, and national security are all inextricably linked. So if you look at our options related to preparing, if you will, or becoming more robust, or doing some good strategic thinking, developing some strategic options to deal with the effects of climate change, you say, can we prevent? If we can, let's try to prevent. If we can't prevent, let's mitigate the effects. And if we can't prevent or mitigate, let us adapt to the conditions that may already be underway caused by the effects of climate change. So it's those aspects of prevention, mitigation, and adaptation that bring us to a subject of energy. And in this case, if we are to believe 99% of the scientific thought internationally ascribed to by every major scientific and engineering society in the United States, the National Academy of Sciences, the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the list goes on, that climate change is real and that one of the main aggravating factors is the production, increasing production of greenhouse gases, not just in developed countries, but in the year 2011, next year, 7 billion human beings on this planet expecting and striving for a higher quality of life, much of that delivered by increased consumption of energy. So if we stay on the path that we have been on for over 100 years with primary reliance on fossil fuels, and we know that greenhouse gas is an accelerant to whatever natural cycles related to climate change may be going on, we're not on a sustainable path. It's not a good thing for us to do that. And do we have any other options? Is it time to reduce our dependence on imported oil for a whole bunch of military, diplomatic, and economic reasons? You bet it is. If you just stipulate for the moment that climate change isn't really a concern, or if it is, we can't do much about it, let's just talk about energy security. If we did things to help become less dependent on fossil fuel and get away from some of the local, regional, and global adverse environmental effects of our dependence on fossil fuel, if we developed clean energy technology industries in this country, indeed, in a leadership role that created high-quality jobs, that basically allowed us to take a look at how we use whatever energy from whatever source we do in more efficient ways, energy efficiency technology, changes in behavior, changes in policies. If we then take a look at new sources of energy, some new, some old, solar, wind, biomass, nuclear power, non-emitting sources of electrical energy, and as a transitional fuel, much relevant to Texas, natural gas and renewable energy as a combination, we see unbelievable opportunities opening up. So I'll conclude by simply saying, when we look at climate change, when we look at energy insecurity in the United States and around the developing world, and we look at international security all together, inextricably linked, there are daunting challenges. But at the same time, we need to look at the tremendous opportunities that they create. Opportunities for diplomatic outreach in regions of the world where the old problems seem to be stalemated, but a new problem like coping, adapting to the effects of climate change or energy insecurity could cause new partnerships, new relationships, new protocols that would allow us to address some of the old problems as well. Tremendous economic opportunity. The stopping of the hemorrhaging of over $1 billion a day out of the U.S. economy simply to pay for our oil addiction. So I look forward to your questions after Admiral Morisetti has framed his aspect of this challenge and opportunity set. And I want to hear what's on your mind, and I welcome, I never got much of it when I was an admiral on active duty, but I welcome pushback and other ideas. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to come here to Austin and to speak here at the Strauss Centre. It's a great privilege. When you do a double act together, and you start to do it around America, around the world, you wonder whether you should have said you go first, because he's covered a lot. However, what I propose to do, and like Admiral McGinn, what I'm actually really interested in is a discussion, because I've come to Austin to learn your perspective on these issues and to exchange ideas and thoughts. But beforehand, I will give you the UK's perspective on the sort of issues that Admiral McGinn's been talking about. You'll notice remarkable similarities in many aspects of it, but also one or two differences which reflect the UK policy. Firstly, I'm active duty. Why has the UK got a Rear Admiral doing this job, working for the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Department of Energy? It's because we think this is a real threat to the future. And threats are threats to national security, and national security is the military's business. Both our nations are busy today on current operations, and the military are very busy along with other agencies as well. But we also have to have an eye to the future. One of those headlights has got to be on full beam, looking over the horizon and seeing what's coming. And increasingly we're understanding that the security implications of climate change, and particularly how it impacts on resource availability, is a threat to our national security. Admiral McGinn has talked about the extreme weather events, high temperatures, lack of water, too much water, rising acidity in the sea, etc. But most of that is not going to happen around the United Kingdom. And actually, a bit of sun around the UK wouldn't go amiss. Maybe that's what I came to Austin for. However, where does it occur? That correlation between the effect of climate change and where global stress already exists. Whether it be food, water, demographics, health, frequently it's in fragile states. Those fragile states tend to be centred around north and south of the equator, where the world's trade routes run. Your nation, my nation, depend on trade. Milk and petrol does not come from Tesco's or Walmart. We import and export. Therefore, we need to be alert to this. And we need to understand how it's going to impact on us. It is not a national issue. It's an international issue. And it's not just one government department or one organisation. It's multi-organisation. It's about those second and third order consequences of climate change. Loss of land and loss of livelihood. Mass unplanned migration and people seeking illegal livelihoods to feed their families. So what are we doing about it in the military? You had your quadrennial defence review earlier this year. We're in the middle of our national security strategy and strategic defence and security review that follows our change of government. In the UK, there's pretty much a bipartisan approach to this, whether you're Conservative or Labour, and in fact Liberal as well now in the coalition. You recognise that climate change is an issue. We need to know what it means in the military for our missions and tasks, and how that impacts on our national interest. More extreme weather, more humanitarian events. What capabilities do we need as we do that first aid, for a better way of putting it, disaster relief? And where we like to do it? And what notice we're going to get? Talked about failed states and fragile states. States without the capacity and resilience to tackle these issues. We, along with a number of other agencies and nations, our partners, could find ourselves trying to build resilience and capacity in those nations. Or we may decide that however much work we put in, such is the magnitude of the challenges they face, that they won't be able to address all of it. And maybe therefore we need a deterrence or a presence in the region to detract from that. And activity in the Horn of Africa and elsewhere is an example of that. We need to have the ability to operate in the world of 2030, 2050. And bearing in mind that when we buy new kit, we buy it to keep 30, 40, 50 years. So we have to think about that, and particularly how we propel that equipment around the world. We in the military are gas guzzlers. In the UK, we don't have the advantage you have of your aircraft carriers being nuclear powered. Ours run on fossil fuels. 12 inches to the gallon, 20 tons an hour when you're launching recovering jets. Yeah, you can do it at $30, $40 a barrel. You can't do it at $200, $300, $400 a barrel, assuming it's available. It also emits a lot of CO2. We need to look at alternatives, be it biofuels, be it other renewables, or rather renewables. We need to be more energy efficient. Half the fuel that goes in the convoys to Camp Bastion, half the convoy in Camp Bastion, our main operating base in Afghanistan, is fuel. Half that fuel runs Camp Bastion. So before the first Marine, soldier, airman or sailor goes out to do what we went to Afghanistan to do, and your soldiers and sailors and airmen went to Afghanistan to do, we've burnt up a quarter of the convoy. At a great loss of life. Afghanistan, Pakistan and coalition. We need to be more energy efficient. We need to change our behaviour. And the other part, which is perhaps where we differ from the United States, is that in 2008 we passed the Climate Change Act. It requires us to reduce our CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. That includes the military. We produce about 1% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 equivalent, and we need to drive ours down. Initially in our estate and infrastructure, but subsequently we need to do it with our fighting equipment as well. That means we have to look at new ways of training, simulation, synthetics, and other efficiency measures. All of that we could do on our own, but it would cost a fortune, and we'd probably miss the best opportunities in one or two cases. We should be working closer with our partners and colleagues, our military colleagues overseas, but also between the public and the private sector, and with industry, trying to share practice. If I want to know the best thing about biofuels, I'd probably talk to Richard Branson of Virgin Atlantic, because he's flying fare-paying passengers around with biofuels. So if he's prepared to do it, he's probably got the right solution. And there are other examples. But if we don't reduce those emissions, then the risks increase. We, like the rest of the world, are trying to keep the limit in temperature rise since pre-industrial periods to no more than 2 degrees centigrade or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, I think we can probably cope with some of the issues for national security. Beyond that, all bets are off. And when you look at what we've released from the UK Foreign Office about the 4-degree world, or the 7 degrees Fahrenheit world, it is quite horrific. I don't know what the metro in Washington would do if the temperature rises by 5 or 6 degrees. I can assure you the London Underground would struggle if it went up by 1 degree. It would start to impact on our way of life and our national security. So it's essential that we address these challenges, but in the process, we take advantage of the opportunities they bring as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
How about the international response, both the non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations responding to climate change, namely the Kyoto Protocol? The reason I bring this up is when it was passed, it was across the board passing. Countries signed it, but the U.S., as we already know, did not go into completely signing it. Reason being that the naming of certain developing countries kind of puts an unfair advantage at countries like China, who are developing and producing a great deal of CO2 emissions at the same time. but they're exempt to a great deal since they're labeled a developing country, whereas the U.S. is not. How can we respond to I guess, these kind of legislation or this kind of issues passed by the international community that doesn't really have any answer on the horizon, but rather kind of puts an unfair advantage in terms of the semantics they use in defining countries and the restrictions that go along with that? How can we respond to that?
I'd start by saying it's not for one nation to tell another nation what to do. That nation's got to make its own mind up. What we can do in the United Kingdom, and we believe that these are the areas that we need to address, is to explain why we're doing it and demonstrate leadership by best practice, and encourage others. I think we will see, and we saw at Copenhagen, as a real challenge when you get 190-odd countries together trying to address these issues. Ultimately, this must lie with the United Nations. This is United Nations business. But we can do more by encouraging regions to take ownership of those issues and explain to them where the opportunities are if they address these things and where the threats are. And all the time our understanding is getting greater of what those are. We can be more specific. If we start to do that, then I think it's peer pressure and other areas. At the end of the day, each nation will make its own decision what it thinks is appropriate. But the others should be pushing and encouraging and cajoling gently to follow the system.
Even in such an existential area as nuclear proliferation, there's a nuclear non-proliferation treaty that's been signed by many, many nations, including, I would add, Iran. And not everybody complies, or complies to the degree that the treaty would, that in fact does call for. So Admiral Morisetti is absolutely right. Nations are going to do what is perceived by them to be in their best interest. But the point that is so important is that there needs to be some leadership, especially leadership by the United States, which is the largest consumer of energy in the world and the largest emitter. China may have overcome our record in that regard, but we have the tremendous advantages of great educational institutions like here at UT, unbelievable infrastructure, from highways to gas pipelines to airports to ports, on and on and on. We've got that almost frontier spirit of innovation. We've lost that spirit of conservation. I remind folks once in a while when I'm told that a lot of the conservatives are against climate change or energy legislation or whatever. Hey, what's the root word of conservative? It's conserve, and it's an American ethic. It's an ethic that is especially evident in our history and in our culture in the state of Texas. So I think that this leadership by the United States, technologically, in terms of policy, and in terms of partnership, is really, really crucial to moving forward. Whether it's Cancun or beyond, we learned a lot in Copenhagen that nobody's going to come together and just everybody join hands and sing Kumbaya. It's going to be a hard road, but we learn things as we go. Nearly 200 nations are going to agree on everything, or maybe even not what size the coffee cups ought to be. Oh, we don't drink coffee in our nation. But I think that we can, in key groups, considering key groups of developing countries, countries that are at greatest risk, think Micronesia, for example, in terms of the threats of a rising sea level, nations that are developed, Europe, United States, others, and those that are kind of in between, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and come up with some protocols that make a lot of sense. One last thing. In Senate testimony last July, I was asked, well, what about this idea of unilateral disarmament, or the climate change greenhouse gas regulation equivalent of unilateral disarmament vis-a-vis China, especially. And the point that I made was China has a set of environmental problems, local and regional especially, that I would not even want to wish on anybody. They are really, really daunting. Air, land, and water. And they're trying to cope with this. They're trying to continue their amazing economic growth, but they're trying to also deal with these tremendously daunting environmental challenges. That's why the Politburo passed regulations that China is going to self-impose limits on its greenhouse gases. They are becoming the world's largest exporter of green technology, especially solar photovoltaic cells and wind turbines, and some energy efficiency technology as well. Oh, by the way, just about all of that was invented by the United States of America in the wake of the OPEC embargo in the 1970s. So the point is, leadership by the United States is key in terms of technology, in terms of policy, for everybody to move forward. And they will move at a pace that suits their own national interest.
Welcome to Austin, Admiral Morisetti, and welcome back to Austin, Admiral McGinn. Essentially, surveying the discussions that are going on with defense procurement, I'd like you to comment on the woeful lack of discussion of any vessels or any kind of capability that is actually going to have utility in the Arctic zone, given the mix of that environment, that seasonal mix. And on the other side, I'd like you to comment on the fact that when a lot of military analysts comment about the opening of the polar seas, polar oceans, they often talk in context of energy extraction, which of course only complicates the matter further. So if you could comment on those two, please.
If I want to get mixed messages, I'll ask a question about the Arctic. It's all going to happen next week. It's 2050. It's going to be benign. It's going to be causing tension. It's going to be for the whole year round. We need 14 weeks a year ice-free, etc. I think we've still got a lot more to learn about the Arctic. Most importantly, we've got to put a form of governance in place so that we can use the Arctic, whether it's as sea routes, whether it is to exploit minerals, or whatever. And when we understand that governance, and those who are going to enforce that governance on an international basis, then I think we're going to understand whose role is what, whether it's an Arctic Council piece, whether it's a wider organisation, etc. And from that process, we will then need to determine which capabilities and who needs capabilities to operate there, because it's more than just thicker steel. It's different steel in that part of the world. And there are other things. It is more likely to be an issue for the United States, Canada, Denmark, Russia, and others than it is the United Kingdom. But it may be a role for us, and that's why we need to be looking, as I talked about, that ability to adapt and to have those capabilities you need in the future. And that is the part of the work that we're doing as part of our security and defence and security review. It is more than energy extraction. It could be where, for much of the year, our shipping moves around, etc. And that's why it's so key that we have that governance.
Let me take another aspect of your question about vessels. I spoke with this several months ago with the United States Navy Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gary Ruffhead. And he and his counterpart in the United States Coast Guard, and in fact chiefs of Navy of other nations that have Arctic interests, are looking at this. But he said it's really hard. He said, if we believe that the Arctic is going to open up and going to need some sort of governance enforcement up there, Coast Guard-like, think Coast Guard regulation, fisheries, environmental regulation, etc., and perhaps mineral extraction, we're going to need to have capability for search and rescue, for enforcement, for monitoring that we don't have now. But speaking as the CNO, I don't have the certainty that I should take money and invest it in large Arctic-capable ice-breaking ships or longer-range helicopters or aircraft that can operate in the extreme weather environments up there until I have a much better idea, as Admiral Morisetti said, about when that need is going to arise. Now, that's not to say there couldn't be some major incident. For example, think 3,000 elderly people on a cruise ship going across the Northwest Passage in 2025, and they get iced in because of a sudden freeze up there, and all the world is watching. Satellite phones come alive, and what are we going to do about this rescue of 3,000 senior citizens off the SS Iceberg? And that could happen, but until something dramatic like that happens, it's going to be more a deliberate thought process, decision process to decide when we need what kinds of capability, air, sea, land, to properly enforce the governance up there and monitor the activities of the Arctic. One last point. I've talked to the Navy's oceanographer, Admiral Dave Titley, and his best estimate, he talks a lot with climatologists across the nation and across the world, and his best guess, and he's not putting any money down on it, is about 4 weeks a year, around 2030 or so, the Arctic could be sufficiently ice-free to allow the opening of what we call the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But he said he's the first one that will tell you, could be sooner, could be for longer, could be later, could be for less, just as Admiral Morisetti started out.
You know, I'd like to make one just follow-up question on that. You note the need for certainty, but also our inability to ever have 100% certainty, and it's definitely something that we grapple with on our program on climate change and political stability specific to Africa. It's looking at how do we and how can we most effectively support the research and policymaking process in terms of predictive analysis and planning on these issues of climate change that have such a long-term, just a longer cycle for policy planning. And from the perspective of government policy planning, but also military acquisitions and mobilization, how are the U.S. and UK governments really identifying the areas of high need and planning response?
I think this is one of the areas that we're slowly coming to terms with. Our traditional challenges and threats have been people, organisations, countries. Now we've got something which is physical, and it's people's reaction to those physical changes. It's much slower, perhaps, than in previous threats and challenges. And we're now beginning to understand where the gaps in our knowledge are. And what we've got to do, which is why we must engage in discussions, particularly between our two countries, but with other nations as well, is to try and fill those gaps. And if we can't fill them straight away, we want to ask people to do research. A lot of the answers, actually, are probably in the academic environment already. And it's corralling that information, getting it together, and then being able to use it, to fuse it, to analyse it, and then use it in order to make those decisions on what capabilities you need, where you may need to take action, what sort of signs you should be looking for. It's a whole new world. It's a move from intelligence to information, and it brings new actors in, people we haven't worked with before. And whether it's through government agencies or through universities, etc., certainly in the United Kingdom, we're at the beginnings of understanding that. We know there's a problem there, but we don't yet know enough about it. In fact, Admiral Mullen, your chairman of your Joint Chiefs, said at the end of last year, we know there's a problem, we need to do more about it. Secretary General of NATO said, we don't know enough, but we know we need to start doing it. We need to start factoring it into our national security strategies. It came out of the QDR, it's coming out of our review as well. And working cross-government and with other agencies to draw that, to build that picture, like you would with any other threat and challenge you face. Then you can judge where you need to take action today or in the near term, and where you can afford to take risk. Because at the end of the day, it is going to be an issue of risk as much as action. Resources will dictate that, if nothing else.
I view it as a gigantic risk management challenge. And the elements of risk are probability and consequence of something bad happening. So I use a rough analogy of medical triage, where you look at places around the world where there is greater probability or likelihood of adverse weather events or sea level rise taking place that are superimposed on large population centers, the consequences, if you will. Coastal areas, Bangladesh comes to mind immediately. And then you say, well, how can we increase the resiliency or the adaptability or the mitigation? What are the mitigation factors to either mitigate the probability of that event taking place or minimizing the consequences? And it all comes down to building in where you can, consistent with the availability of and the willingness to use resources to create more resilient nations, more resilient societies. So you have a non-governmental actor like Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that are investing in agricultural research to develop more flood-resistant, more saltwater-resistant crops, grain crops, rice and other grains. You have the United Nations in various forms that are developing better immunization against waterborne disease as another aspect. You have the United States Army and the United States Southern Command and all of its service components working in Central America on civil works projects, as they have literally for decades, but trying to build infrastructure down there that enables those nations to be more resilient against the very frequent hurricanes and torrential rain events that happen in those areas. So it's a triage. You need to carefully do the analysis that Admiral Morisetti talked about, learn more, but always in the back of your organizational planning, in your individual planning, keep in mind that this is a new threat, that it's real, and you certainly don't want to. I'll stay with the medical analogies. As the Hippocratic Oath says, first do no harm. So let's not make things worse by continuing to spew greenhouse gases into the atmosphere without carefully thinking about the consequences.
So current clean technology cannot support society right now. So how can we get, I think the numbers right now is the amount of money that the US government invests in pharmaceutical research in a year, you can compare to the amount of money that they invest in energy research, and the energy research will be 1 day of what you use in pharmaceutical research. So how can we convince government, society, industry to invest more money on energy research? And then a second question is, most countries are focused in one type of energy, which is oil. And that is a big problem right now because we all need this one thing. So how can we keep governments to have an open mind that we will probably need multiple kinds of energies, so to do research in multiple areas?
I'll start by saying that I hadn't heard that comparison of expenditures on pharmaceutical research versus energy. I do know that energy research, while still far from adequate, has increased significantly over the past 2 years, and that's starting to yield some good results. I think what's the expression? The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and I think that people need, through forums such as this, to understand that energy insecurity is not a good place to be, and that it doesn't get better in a business-as-usual world. So we need to think through the adverse consequences of continuing to be primarily reliant on fossil fuel, and then ask ourselves, are there some alternatives that we can develop that will avoid the bad consequences of that business-as-usual over-reliance on fossil fuel? So, energy efficiency, squeezing maximum quality of life and economic value out of every kilowatt hour of electricity or every gallon of liquid gas we use for various mobile transportation purposes is a good place to start. I mean, it's been described as low-hanging fruit. I mean, another way of putting it is energy efficiency is the best energy that never has to be mined, drilled, or burned, and it doesn't have any emissions. And so that is a great place to start. And strictly from a business standpoint, from a government business standpoint, from a private sector business standpoint, I like things that can save money in energy efficiency, in investments in energy efficiency, whether it's training programs for employees or behavioral education in, hey, turn off the lights and this type of thing, even before you start getting into the technology, makes a tremendous amount of sense. Regards I'll put it this way, the portfolio of our future energy that will meet our needs. On the Military Advisory Board, somebody once said, you know, it's clear to me that in looking at our future energy, there's no silver bullet. And there isn't. But I said, yeah, but there's some silver buckshot. And what we need to do is take a look at each element of that silver buckshot and do an objective, non-advocacy analysis of the costs, the risks, and the benefits of every form of alternative energies. I mentioned some of them earlier. And let the private sector judge, let the market forces judge, but let us use government policy as a catalyst to start those market forces in place. So one thing that really, really is necessary in this regard in the United States is energy and climate policy that recognizes that the prices that we are paying for energy do not even come close to accounting for the costs that we are already bearing for that energy. I've seen credible and conservative analysis that if we factored in the externalities of gasoline, we'd be paying around $7 a gallon at the pump right now. Fact of the matter is we are paying it, it's just not at the pump. It's not captured by the price of a gallon of gasoline. It's captured by taxes, it's captured by fees, it's captured by the costs of keeping our military in exotic places in the world, defending the lifeblood of the world's economy called oil. So I think that we really need to expand our portfolio beyond fossil fuel, but we need to have a good catalyst. Many of the states, more than half the states, have things like renewable electricity or renewable portfolio standards for increasing the mix of renewable energy. Those are good things. Creating market certainty with national level policy, energy policy, that allows investors to not worry about the investment tax credit or the production tax credit running out next year because the legislature or the Congress fails to reenact it. That's not a way to encourage private sector investment, because what we need is private sector investment and a scaling up so that the price of a kilowatt hour or the price of a gallon of alternative bio-based fuel is more competitive than with what we have today. We need to start in that direction. One last point. If you have stock in oil companies or gas companies, don't sell it because we didn't get on oil overnight and we're not going to get off it overnight, nor should we. But we need to start. We need to take some prudent steps in that new direction.
$12 a gallon for petrol helps focus the mind, but it's not enough. And I would just reiterate what Admiral McGinn has said. There's an education piece that is fundamental. Too many people assume that it's available, whether it's for your motor vehicles, for your heating, to generate the electricity for your lighting, whatever, on demand, and that will always be there at a price that we can afford to pay. The reality is different, but we haven't yet done enough about educating people of that fact, so that there starts to be a demand that we look to alternatives. The issues are very similar on both sides of the Atlantic. I sit on the UK's International Energy Committee with our new government looking for us to find recommendations to them on our energy policy under that umbrella of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we're looking at alternative sources. It will probably be in through phases, using those same things of behavioural changes, energy efficiency of existing equipment, what's achievable, whilst pushing the boundaries of technology and getting the private sector to do that as we design new equipment. key to getting the private sector to invest is having a policy. And from the work we're doing at the moment, the UK will then come out with its policy, and that will help to encourage industry and others to get engaged in the process, and they can see the benefits that way. But fundamental to the whole thing comes back to the need to educate people to understand why we've got to get off fossil fuel and wean ourselves off it.
There are some simple things that folks can do, and I think we need to, as Americans, take charge of our own destiny in this regard and not wait for answers to come out of Washington or Wall Street or Detroit. You can increase the fuel efficiency of whatever vehicle that you're driving by inflating the tires, changing the air filter, and driving it like it wasn't a jackrabbit. And that can increase your fuel efficiency by 10 to 15%. So put in dollar terms, instead of putting $20 in the old gas tank, I'm putting 16 if I've captured on the high end of that. I'm putting 18. That's real money. There are so many things that can be done in terms of weatherization of homes, of apartments, businesses, houses, large industrial facilities. There are things that capture waste heat that go up into the atmosphere in the form of thermal energy, but you can put a grid in a smokestack and capture just the heat and turn it into electrical energy to help drive some of the auxiliary machinery in that industrial process. That's like grabbing dollars as they fly up the smokestack, and all kinds of benefits to the environment increase as well. So there are a lot of things that we can do. As Admiral Morisetti said, behavior is number one, based on knowledge. Second is let's squeeze the most value we can out of the stuff that we've got, the technology we've got, the homes, the automobiles, the businesses that we have. We can do so much better. It is an American tradition to do this. You go back to the World War II era. I've read about it. I wasn't born then. And basically, across this country, we were saving everything. We were saving old rags. We were saving little pieces of metal. We were growing victory gardens to grow our own food. We were doing all kinds of things, and certainly gas rationing was a way of life. I'm not suggesting we should do that. We don't need to do that, but we can get back into that frame of mind in which the 21st century victory garden may be windmills on small areas or solar panels on residences or businesses, because we are becoming more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, and we're doing it with the infrastructure we have available. At the same time, we're creating policies to create better technology solutions in the future.
Part of that education is to explain that it doesn't mean it's a poorer quality of life, it's just a different quality of life and achieved in a different fashion. We can still go and enjoy the things we enjoy, we just create or generate them in a different manner.
Just going along with what you said with using current technologies and reducing emissions as much as possible, to the best of my understanding, we either have or we're really close to having the technologies capable of sending solar panels into space and placing them in an orbit such that it never leaves, it always faces the sun. If you could comment on this, whether it's true, the validity of it, and if so, why aren't we doing this? Thank you.
Yeah, I've read some things along those lines, and it borders on science fiction. It isn't fiction. There are some engineering schemes with broad brush views of how you would do it. It takes about 5 technological miracles and 7 economic miracles to actually make it happen. The problem is one of distance. If you've got just the cost per pound of getting stuff in the kind of orbit that would be required, the cost of the stuff itself, how you actually deliver it down to Earth, all kinds of tremendous challenges. The thing I like about an idea like that, however, is that it's the kind of far-reaching thought that is going to produce those low probability but high payoff advantages in meeting our energy future. I'll tell a story about, I was over in the Netherlands. This is a story of change. I was over in the Netherlands and I was interviewed by a really well-researched, renowned journalist over there. And we were talking about these issues, and he said, you know, I went back and I checked some old newspapers. And in 1905, the biggest problem that they were concerned about in Amsterdam was the overflow of horse manure. And it was because urbanization was starting to take place in Amsterdam. People wanted to live there. It was a center of commerce. It was a major port. And oh, by the way you got around in 1905 in Amsterdam was either walking, some bicycles, but by horseback or horse-drawn wagon. And they had a problem. So and about the time that the problem was getting really, really bad, somebody came along and invented the internal combustion engine and automobiles, and all of a sudden, fast forward 100 years to 2005. Well, horse manure has taken the form of greenhouse gases. And I guarantee you that in the year 2105, we're not going to be worrying about greenhouse gases. We'll be worrying about something else, probably space invaders or something. But this progress of technology and big ideas that can fundamentally change the way we live and trade and engage in commerce is enormous. How many people in the United States had these 20 years ago? 20 years ago, hardly anybody. How many people had cell phones? I can't name 5 people in my whole experience in life that doesn't have a cell phone, or 2 or 3 or more. The information technology has overwhelmed us with challenges and with great opportunities. And that has happened in a very, very short period of time. If we put our minds to it, we can really, really meet these energy and climate change challenges in a very similar way. And I think it's big, broad ideas, but also it's the small things like making sure the air in the tires is at the proper pressure. I'd say 30 psi would be about right.
One of the themes that you had at the beginning of your prepared remarks was that climate change will produce pressures on trade routes and increasing resource scarcity, which may provide incentives for increasing deterrence capabilities. And particularly, as probably Ms. Moran could tell us more, in between the two tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, a lot of this has been centered on places like Africa. Now, as you said in your remarks, that China is the world's largest exporter of green technologies, it will also soon enough become the world's largest importer of energy resources. I was wondering whether you could comment, keeping sort of the idea about trade routes and resource scarcity in mind, whether the fact that's also to the side that China is increasing both its green water and blue water naval capabilities will exacerbate problems such as political instability in Africa, climate change, these sorts of things, or whether this is not too much of a thing to worry about, that this is the right of a sovereign nation to increase its military capabilities as they see fit.
I'll start very quickly. I don't think it's a huge worry. I think it's something that we've got a lot of smart people and the United States government watching very closely. One of the things that Secretary of Defense Gates really has been encouraging his Chinese counterpart to do is to engage in dialogue and more military-to-military contact. Some of that could be related to increasing the resilience of China and other nations around the world, including in Africa. And that would be a very, very nice partnership opportunity for the United States. So I'm not overly worried. But I think continuing to monitor what their intentions are, what their capabilities are, is really, really important in case it really got ugly several decades down the road. Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't got a crystal ball, and I don't know where it's going, but I would agree with Admiral McGinn. The key is to engage with other nations, other countries that are building maritime forces or whatever they're doing, try and understand why they're doing it, where the benefits are, where the challenges are. And yeah, there's a lot of sea out there. There's a lot of governance to be done. And I can assure you that neither the US Navy or the Royal Navy can do it on their own, certainly not the Royal Navy. And we should be doing it with partners. Some of them are new partners. But talking with them is the most important thing, is to understand what's happening.
You know, following on your comment about leadership of some nations and fostering new partnerships, do you think that climate change poses an opportunity for regional collaboration in areas subject to prone to conflict?
Yeah, I mean, it's something as Admiral McGinn knows, I bang the drum about this one. And it's based on our experience with maritime security. We talked about the 500 ship, when you have 500 ship Navy, talked about global maritime policemen, etc. Actually, we needed regions to take ownership of what was going on in their own waters. And from that, we all benefited, because we got much more security in those waters, whether it be in Southeast Asia, whether it's around the coast of America, whether it's in the European coast, or whatever. We should be doing the same on the issues of climate security and climate change. But maybe those developed nations should provide some guidance and leadership and support to the developing nations. I think America has a part to play vis-à-vis South America. I think that the European Union has a part to play in Africa with the African Union. And we can see the Asian Regional Forum or other organisations in the Far East working together to build up understanding of the issues and look to solutions as well. And I think you'll find that because you're doing it on a regional basis, there's much greater ownership of those issues because it's much more apparent to you. And then when you bring it together under the United Nations umbrella or whatever, there is much more likelihood of progress and success.
Thanks, Admiral, for the talk. I would like to focus on the science and technology part. Admiral McGinn talked about the value of cost efficiency, because you want to see the energy efficiency and then lowers cost. But what's ironic right now is today, fossil fuel is actually the most efficient and most cost-effective form of energy. What I think face a lot of countries today is that this trade-off between energy efficiency and the standard of living. You mentioned that people want to have more energy, increase their standard of living, spend more energy, but that challenges is how we can have the technology to sustain it. United States and Great Britain has probably one of the best research facilities, and we have developed many technologies. But to the rest of the countries, they don't have that technology. To them, to be able to convert to a new form of energy has to take more opportunity cost. And so instead of trading policies saying, let's both lower energy efficient or carbon dioxide emission by 10%, shouldn't we share technology and make them easier for other countries to do it?
I think we should. Your comment initially about fossil fuel being the cheapest is true if you don't put a price on carbon. If you don't take into consideration the very real costs environmentally, local, regional, and global that we are paying for our fossil fuel, and the risks as well. We've talked about that a lot, so I won't go there. But in terms of developing nations, I think there does have to be some set of protocols developed for sharing technology. I've used the example of what happened in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union came apart. Eastern European nations wanted to have a world-class telecommunications system. And they could have gone out and cut down a bunch of trees and created telephone poles and electrical power lines and gotten some copper futures from Chile and other places around the world and tried to replicate the telecommunications system that the United States had evolved into and other nations in Western Europe. But they didn't, because there was better technology available called wireless. And they have world-class telecommunications systems in Eastern Europe today, but it was done in a different way. So by the same token, developing nations that are seeking and deserve a higher quality of life that is powered by electricity could do it the old way with principal reliance on the energy density of fossil fuel, and in some cases the relative availability of it. But there are also more and more alternatives to that are coming online. The efficiency and deployment of solar in both photovoltaic form as well as concentrated solar power. The just beginning stages of coastal tidal types of energy systems, offshore wind, ocean thermal energy, geothermal, deep geothermal wells. These are all great sources, potential sources of energy that don't have the environmental costs, in some cases real costs, of a higher conflict potential than a continued reliance on fossil fuel. But in all of this, we do need to figure out how we can share with less rich developing countries the technologies that will give them that higher quality of life and will put them in a much better economic position.
Yeah, I agree entirely. We're going to have these protocols. But I think the other thing is, I think the sharing of technology may go both ways. As other countries, which perhaps today fall into the developing category, develop some capabilities, they should be prepared to share that technology with more established nations and more developed nations in order that we can get the benefits. In the same way, between developed countries, they should be doing that. I know the UK gallon is bigger than the American gallon. I wouldn't look at a car that can't do 55 miles to the gallon and move my family around at 90 miles an hour. That technology is around. Perhaps Americans should be demanding that from their cars. There's things that we could learn from America. That flow of exchanging of ideas needs to happen now if we're going to make best use of best practice.
I had a truck once that could do that, but it was over a cliff.
Was it? You see, the world's moved on now. You see, it's much better.
In terms of the public perception of the dangers of climate change, and particularly in the state of Texas, is one in which there's a lot of skepticism. And there's actually, within the United States as a whole, there's basically a lot of ignorance about the threat that it poses. The question is really about the military's role in addressing this issue. And it was interesting to me that when your report came out, I knew the day it came out. It was also during a time when there's kind of a lot of concern that there would be something about carbon tax in the U.S. There was kind of a sea change in attitudes in Texas about that, okay, this is finally an issue that we should be addressing. I thought it was very valuable to have a security perspective. But I would say there's probably greater than 90% chance that we're going to exceed that 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, that the risks that are associated with that are coming. So what is the role of the military or security agencies have in dealing with this issue? And I'm also kind of puzzled because usually I think of militaries as protecting a nation but unable to act within its own borders. But then yet, and for something like this, they can't really go out and fix it in a kind of a military style. So I'm just puzzled by what is the military's role in this. Because I view this as largely a political problem rather than a military one. So
what the military can do is put in their quadrennial defense review and report to Congress in February of this year that climate change is a concern because of the instability factor. What they can do is put in mandates, as Secretary of the Navy Ray Mabus has done, that the Navy, Department of the Navy, including Marine Corps and Navy, are going to cut by 50% their use of fossil fuel by 2020. They can put soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into training programs that make them more aware of the need to be much more energy efficient, not because of energy efficiency in and of itself, but because it makes them more militarily effective. Recall Admiral Morisetti's comment about only 25% of a convoy actually getting to the principal focus of the mission. And I think also because our veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan have a very, very keen appreciation for what our overdependence on fossil fuels is doing. they are speaking out. There are several organizations, as well as individuals, that are telling us that this path isn't the best path, that we do have to change. And lastly, I would say the U.S. Department of Defense overall is about 2% of the energy use in the United States. It's a huge amount. And in this regard, to the extent that the United States military and the Department of Defense and other federal agencies become a customer of clean energy technology, it can move the needle on the market, and it can start getting those economies of scale where you take small companies that are having to charge larger prices per unit to do what they do, when they can sell in greater volume, whether it's plug-in electric cars or hybrids or energy efficiency technology or biofuels based on algal oil or other things that the United States military is starting to buy. That makes it much more affordable. I can't imagine what the first internet network that was developed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Department of Defense cost, but it was very, very expensive. But what it did was it enabled this kind of connectivity, and same thing is true, the cost of the global positioning system. How many people can find their way home, I mean, especially on a bad night, without their global positioning system? These are just a couple of examples where I think, in addition to protecting national security in a traditional sense, the military can make a tremendous amount of difference and inform the policymakers that this is real, that we can and are doing something about it, and we need to do something about it for the larger nation.
What it's not about is the military hijacking climate change to get more money from Congress or from Parliament. But it's about all the things that Admiral McGinn's talked about, and it's about providing leadership. Providing leadership as we deliver national security, and we do it in a fashion which means we can meet the challenges of the future without damaging the future environment. So I think we have a very key role to play.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Admiral McGinn and Admiral Morisetti, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us here today. Oh.
Thank you. Well done.